In this tutorial, we're going to learn how to make a perspective shadow in the GIMP. A cartoon shadow, but it'll work with, regular images too, not just cartoonish type things. But I have an object that I want to use. We'll open it up. I have an object that I want to use that I think is going to make a great perspective shadow. Alright, so let's go ahead and copy this and go back to our main composite here, and I want to select the moon surface because I'm going to paste it into a new layer right above that. So edit, paste as a new layer, and now we got our little UFO. Alright, so with our little alien in it, and it's got, the ship itself is opaque, the alien is opaque, but the canopy up here is actually semi-transparent. So you're going to get that effect from the shadow as well. So the shadow will actually have a less opaque area where that bubble is. Okay, so let me see here, UFO. We're going to rename that layer to UFO1. And then what we're going to do is we're going to duplicate this. And this is the easiest, best looking method I've found for creating perspective shadows in the GIMP. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my UFO and I'm going to duplicate that. And I'm going to go up here, I'm going to call it UFO1 shadow. And I'm going to go back to my UFO layer here and I'm going to lock it down so that I can't accidentally change it. All of my other layers should already be protected. Yeah, I think so, except for the UFO shadow. Okay, so the first thing that we want to do is we want to turn this opaque black. All right, so what we're going to do is we're going to right click on it and we're going to select color and we're going to go to desaturate and then we're going to desaturate that. And that's going to give us a grayscale version of this, mode luminance on the desaturation. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to right click it, I'm going to go into colors and I'm going to go into brightness and contrast. And I'm going to turn my contrast up to the maximum and I'm going to turn my brightness down to the minimum. And what I end up with is the ship is now an opaque black color. The alien up there is an opaque black color, even his antennas, but the top, the canopy, the transparent part is still semi-transparent. It's just grayscale now. So I want to go ahead and I will select that. Now there's one area here that didn't quite get converted, and that was, I think that's where the alien's single eye is. So what we're going to do is we've got black as our foreground color. We're going to go over here and we're going to choose our brush. Well, it's like pencil. And then we're going to go over here and we're going to use that black and we're going to color his eye in, that little tiny sliver of his eye that didn't quite get converted. All right, so I'm going to go back to my move tool. All right, now what I want to do is I want to take this image because it's vertical like the original image, and what I want to do is I want to lay it down like it's like a shadow would. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go up and I'm going to select my 3D transform. And if you guys haven't watched my previous episode on GIMP does 3D, we used the 3D transform in that tutorial. So that'll give you a little background information on it. I will have a link to all of our GIMP tutorials, a link to the GIMP tutorial playlist in the show notes. So, and this image that we're using for our background, there's a link in the show notes to download it. There's a link to the UFO vector graphic, a link where you can download that. So you can follow along in the tutorial the same way I'm showing you now. I'm going to go ahead and close out my UFO image there. All right, so we got our 3D transform tool. So I'm going to click in the upper center of it. I'm going to hold down my left mouse button and you can see that the 3D tool's got the rotate selected. It's got 3 different tabs. Rotate is selected. So I'm going to grab the top, hold down my mouse button, my left mouse button, and I'm going to drag it I'm going to drag it to make it flat, like a tabletop. Okay. Now I want to go to my move tool here, and your there's a X, Y, and Z axis. Now your X axis runs from left to right. Your Y axis runs from the bottom of the screen to the top of the screen. You know, and then your Z axis is like your eyes looking through the screen. That's your Z axis. So it brings things, closer or further away. So in order to bring this down, I want to bring it down along the Y axis. So let me click this and bring it down toward the bottom of the UFO. All right. And then I want to go to my rotate tool again, and I've got it selected for the center on my rotation. So now what I want to do is I just want to pivot it around the y-axis so that you get a perspective of about 30 degrees offset, for your shadow. Because if you look at the shading on the back side of the UFO, it looks like the sunlight is coming in at about a 30-degree angle, or about the I guess you'd call it about the 5 o'clock position, like the 4:30 to 5 o'clock position on a clock. So I want to go to my move tool, or on my rotate tool, and I want to rotate it around the y-axis. So I'm just kind of pivoting it here. See that? And that looks right there. It looks about right, I think. So I'm going to go ahead. I'm going to do my transform on that. And so we've transformed the shadow. Now I'm going to go to my move tool, and I'm going to grab it. I'm just going to kind of scoot it over here, like so. And then I want to scale it up a little bit. It looks like it's, I want to make it look like the angle of the sunlight is coming in a little bit lower. I mean, the way the shadow looks now, I mean, it's fine. This would work fine, but it looks like the sunlight is coming in at a pretty oblique angle on top of the UFO. So I just want to scale it out a little bit. So I'm going to go to my scale tool here. And I'm going to grab it, and I'm going to scale it out just a little bit, like so. And then scale it. And then I want to take my shadow, and I want to lower it below my UFO. The shadow needs to be below the item that is actually creating the shadow. So I'm going to take my UFO shadow layer, and I'm going to drop it down below my UFO. So now you can see it looks more realistic now. I'm going to grab my move tool again. I'm going to pull it out just a little bit, kind of like the UFO is hovering just above the ground, like it's not actually touching it, so that you can actually see that little bulbous area underneath the UFO right here, create the shadow. I want to see that part of the shadow. So I think that right there looks like a pretty good position, especially looking at the shading at the edges of the UFO here. I think that looks pretty good right there. Okay, so I like the position of my shadow, and it seems to curve, toward along the surface of our little, moon here. So now what I want to do is I just want to blur it a little bit, make it a little less defined than it currently is. So I'm going to right click it, and I'm going to go into my filters, and I'm going to go into blur, and I'm going to go into Gaussian blur. And make sure that you got your preview checked here so you can actually see it before you apply it. So I've got my X and my Y offset here, and so I'm going to turn, let me see, my filter, my clipping, Gaussian blur. Let me go up here and increase the blur just a hair, like right there, and bring it down. So it goes from 1.5. 1.5 looks pretty good, but I think it's a little too well defined, and 2.5 I think just looks a little too fuzzy. So I'm going to input in here. I'm going to put in 2.0 on the fuzziness of my shadow. I like the way that looks. Okay, so now that I've got my shadow set up the way I want it, my fuzziness, my offset, I'm going to go ahead and select OK. And I think that looks pretty good. Now the last thing we need to do is you've got a lot of bright light coming in on top of this UFO, and you can see that the surface of our moon is very, very bright. So the shadow is going to be fairly well defined. But I want to increase the transparency just a little bit. So I've got my UFO shadow layer here selected that we just blurred. I'm going to go into my opacity and I'm going to enter in 90%. And so you see how that softens up the shadow, it lightens up the shadow and softens up the shadow a bit. Maybe we could go with, let's say 92%. I think that looks even better. So we got 92% there. And I think that shadow looks really good. It actually looks like the UFO is hovering above the surface. It's not like, sitting down on top of the surface, and it's casting that shadow. I think that perspective shadow looks good. Here's the area I was talking about where the alien is opaque inside the spacecraft like it should be. And then the area around the bubble, you can see that it doesn't create as opaque a shadow as, of course, the body of the ship does or the alien does, because it's semi-transparent. So you actually get that effect too, which is why I use this object for this tutorial. But I think that looks really, really good. One other thing I want to do, I'm going to protect my UFO shadow here. I'm going to lock it down so I can't accidentally change it. And I'm going to go to my UFO layer and I'm going to unprotect it. And the reason I'm doing that is because I think it's going to look good. It's going to look better with just a tiny bit of drop shadow on the object as well to give it a little bit of depth. So I'm going to right click my UFO and I'm going to go into filters and I'm going to go into light and shadow and I'm going to go into drop shadow. I'm going to turn my blur radius all the way down for right now so I can see the shadow better. And I'm going to turn the opacity all the way up. And then I'm going to decrease my offsets here. I don't want the shadow that defined. And I think about right there when I blur it and set my opacity. So let's go ahead and set our blur radius for about 8. Maybe a little bit less. Let's go 4. I think that looks better. So we got 4. And then with the opacity, let's play with the opacity. I think about 0.869. Let's say 0.9. 0.9. I think that looks pretty good. So I'm going to go ahead and select OK, and then I'll select my background layer here so you can see it better. So now you see how the drop shadow actually adds a little bit of depth to our UFO. And sets it apart, from the lunar surface, and then it really now looks like it's hovering above the surface rather than setting on the surface, which is the effect that I was going for. So this method that I just showed you creates a pretty good looking perspective shadow. So remember the links to the background that I'm using for this, the link to the UFO is in the show notes. Links to the playlist, the GIMP tutorial playlist, is in the show notes. That has all the tutorials that I've completed on the GIMP so far, as well as other applications. There'll be links to those there too. But that's a wrap on this episode. I'll see you next time in the Tinkerz Lab.